Hello, everybody. I'm Natalie Brunell. Thank you so much for checking out my show, where I get to hear from the leading voices in Bitcoin, financial markets, political structures, philosophy, and more. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show. And if you're watching this on YouTube, like this video so more people see it and hit that notifications button so you don't miss out on any new content. This podcast does not provide financial advice. It is for educational and entertainment purposes only. So make sure you always do your own research before making any financial decisions and be aware of your risk tolerance. I'm able to produce this show thanks to my sponsors, and I'm very picky about who I choose to partner with. So I hope you'll take the time to listen to the ad reads throughout the show. I'm also able to produce this show thanks to the support of my listeners and viewers, value for value. So if you'd like to make a donation to help the show grow, you can find my Bitcoin and Lightning wallets in the description. All right, now to my main partner, Swan Bitcoin. Swan is where I do all of my Bitcoin purchases. In fact, I dollar cost average every single day, not every week, not bi-monthly, every single day. And they have the lowest fees in the space. I love Swan Bitcoin because it is a true Bitcoin only company. Swan has a ton of free educational resources on their website, and they now have a mobile app, which I've been using to smash by some Bitcoin. And Swan Studios produces my new show, Hard Money, which covers the biggest news in Bitcoin and the global economy. It's like an orange-pilled version of CNBC, so make sure to check that out on YouTube for all the biggest headlines, because we are not afraid to question the mainstream narrative. All right, it's time for the show. All right, super excited for this episode. I have Pete Rizzo with me, editor of Bitcoin Magazine and an expert on Satoshi Nakamoto. So I'm excited for all the things we're about to get into. Pete, thanks for joining me.
Glad to be here.
All right, let's start with your backstory. You just informed me that you're originally from Massachusetts. You live still on the East Coast. Tell me a little bit about your background. Where are you from exactly? And tell me a little bit about your childhood.
Interesting. Yeah, Massachusetts by birth. Came into Bitcoin through journalism. Passion of mine always has been writing and finding interesting stories. And that was certainly my inroads to Bitcoin, right? Way back in 2013, I was a young writer based in the state who was eager to make a name for myself. I was trying to freelance at various publications and not getting a lot of headway. And I heard about this crazy thing called Bitcoin, which was this mashup then of technology, money, and, to be honest, a bunch of, very weird, strange people talking about a subject that I always find pretty esoteric in an interesting new way. So I sort of dove in. I found an editor there at a local payments publication who was willing to give me some bylines. And, I figured I could become an expert in the subject. And so I did. So I wrote some stories in 2013 about Bitcoin. I think one of the first was about a comedian that was accepting Bitcoin payments. I wrote about a local restaurant in Boston, vegan restaurant that was accepting Bitcoin payments. And through my freelancing, I found my way to a website called CoinDesk, which I just started, and I was eventually became part of the original team there. Essentially, probably one of the first 4 or 5 people, to do what I guess is now called cryptocurrency journalism, which is essentially, we were on a Skype channel talking about the news of the day and writing about Bitcoin. So, yeah, my origin is, I like any writer, you try to find a story that's worthy of being your muse. And I think with Bitcoin, it's always been interesting to me, and I've just always felt that the story has more and more layers, and it's never been boring. So from there, I've been publishing ever since.
I love that. Well, my assignment is Bitcoin as well, and it's the best assignment that I've ever had, certainly as a journalist. So when you were little, were you watching a lot of news or consuming a lot of newspapers? And were you the kid that worked at the school newspaper and wanted to do that when you grew up?
Yeah, interesting question. I don't know. I don't really feel like I ever fell into traditional journalism. I was actually originally an English major, so I have more of a literary, reading books sort of background. But to be honest, in college, I just had such a trouble writing anything because college is a fast-paced environment. There's a lot of things going on, and I actually started doing journalism just to force myself to write. So I actually just went to the school paper. I interviewed some people down there. I actually got assigned to the arts desk. So, writing about movie reviews and local comedy reviews. So the furthest subject you could get from Bitcoin, as you could possibly get, right? Not really interested in money, finance. And to be honest, I had a classic, Northeastern liberal disdain for a lot of that stuff. I never really thought I would find a lot of that stuff interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly when I was at college, it was these Obama years, a lot of optimism about of in that time. And so,
It
yeah, I
was
don't
the
know.
what years? The what years you cut out?
Obama years,
Oh, okay.
Obama years. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know. I dove in, in terms of finance and money, and my real introduction is Bitcoin, right? I didn't really have another. There was nothing else in my past that would have prepared me for being interested in that. I think other than Bitcoin made it accessible to me, right? It actually told the story of money and finance through characters who are interesting and people who are just naturally talking about finance in an interesting way. Because I think I'd always found it kind of like an elitist concept, right? There was always kind of filled with all these buzzwords, and usually the people who were doing finance were, people who are, manipulative banker type people. Whereas with Bitcoin, everything was on the ground floor, right? You had this people from all walks of life having very interesting conversations, and the conversations were really about fundamentally what is this concept of money, like what is payments, what does it mean to have finance. So it took something that I think I wouldn't have found interesting, but it placed it in a setting where I was like, oh, okay. I always tell the story that, writing about finance before Bitcoin, I imagine it was like, this gray, dark room, and it was like someone popped a piñata. You made this thing that was really boring, interesting suddenly. And yeah, I don't know, I've always felt that way about Bitcoin. It unlocked subjects for me that I think I probably could have lived my whole life without
Mm-hmm.
interfacing in any meaningful way. And I think I try to bring that to my work. I try to remember how like deeply disgusted I was with finance, like as a concept prior to coming to Bitcoin. Because I think most people are still there intellectually or just emotionally. They just have very little interest in being involved in any way, and it's almost like an afterthought
Yeah.
for most people.
Well, it's also interesting how it sort of flips what you thought you knew about the financial system, right? Because I would have before Bitcoin been on the side that maybe, was wanting people to protest on Wall Street, the 99%, when
Yeah.
really you should be protesting at the central bank, in front of the Federal Reserve,
Well, yeah,
because they
actually,
enable these
it's funny that
incentives.
you mentioned that. Yeah, I actually did go to some of the Occupy Wall Street protests, and that was very formative, I think, for a lot of young people my age. I was just coming out of college at that time, and there was like a sense of unrest, right? I think the stages of being aware of finance, that for me was really just disdain, and then sort of like an unrest, this feeling that there was this like complex system that was manipulating you or creating these negative outcomes. Obviously, my friends, we graduated into an economy that was just
Yeah.
decimated.
Yep.
And I think it's funny, I was at a journalism reunion for my graduating class maybe like 3 years ago, and I think I was one of like a handful of people who even had a journalism job, right? So
Wow.
just completely
Yeah.
changed everything.
Yeah. Okay, wait. So when did you first hear about Bitcoin? Do you remember how you learned about it? Was it through a Google search before you went down that path and decided, hey, I'm going to become an expert in this, which by the way, I think is very smart, because I think especially today as a journalist, if you don't have an area that you really specialize in, it hurts you in terms of
Mm,
building your career. And I always told my students on the broadcast side, this is what newspapers always had right, is like having a beat where you could
mm,
specialize, build sources, because then you are an expert and then you're more marketable and you have an advantage. Whereas, traditional TV, you're kind of a jack of all trades and like a lot of things at the surface level, but you
mm,
don't know very in depth about any one thing. And we can see that now with crypto Bitcoin, because media
mm,
does not know how to report on it at all. So where
mm.
did you first hear about it and know, hey, I want to go down this path and become an expert, because that's going to serve me down the road?
Yeah, geez, I don't know if I ever knew that. I mean, I certainly think that I can remember when I first learned about Bitcoin. I had just started freelancing for that payments publication I mentioned, and it was in May of 2013. A little exchange called Mt. Gox had just struck a deal with a U.S. company to license their brand name to start an exchange in the U.S. So this would have been in May 2013. The price was just maybe around $50. People were starting to go to Bitcoin meetups. But yeah, it's interesting connecting that to the press, right? For me, it was what got me involved was the story. And I think why I stayed interested in it was because I was on the ground floor and I was able to ask questions and learn about Bitcoin in real time. I have a lot of sympathy for people who are coming to Bitcoin from a traditional journalism background today, because I just think the amount of material that you need to understand to be an expert in it is really so high. And I think, I was on a panel at Bitcoin Amsterdam with this young woman from the Financial Times, and I think I really got a good perspective there of just how much they don't know about what
The
they
one
don't
that kept
know.
saying like.
Yeah, Jemima Kelly, yes, that'd be her name. But yeah, she, I made the point to her on stage, which essentially to write anything meaningful about Bitcoin, you have to write your criticism from a place of knowledge, and really understanding Bitcoin requires understanding money, understanding the financial system, understanding technology, cryptography, a lot of things that actually are, kind of outside the mainstream, and you do have to take time to kind of understand. And yeah, I think that's the biggest frustration that I have with mainstream journalists is I just think they don't feel like they need to take the time. And it's almost seen like if you understand Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies in any way, it's seen as like a negative for you as a journalist. Not even like any knowledge about it. It like makes you suspect in their eyes. I mean, I think we saw this last year when Bloomberg and some of the major kind of publications were coming in the space and they started hiring for positions. And they would interview people with, market experience, and they would consistently hire people without that, right? Who are coming from, as you said, the more generalist kind of journalist perspective. And I think it just does such a disservice. I mean, we've just seen a massive amount of financial loss from consumers at this point, from participating in the cryptocurrency markets. And I had a long conversation with someone at the New York Times recently where I said, it's time that journalists have to take this seriously. At what point, how much money do people have to lose before the New York Times, like feels comfortable hiring someone who knows something about Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies at all? And it could just be something general, right? And I'm not even saying that person has to write the story themselves. If you're still uncomfortable with that, I'm just saying like you don't employ a single person like on staff. This market's $1 trillion market, and it is littered with these kind of scams and fly by night companies that it was funny. I was saying this like, 4 or 5 weeks before the FTX collapse, and the person really was struggling to understand where I was coming from.
Yeah.
Now I feel a bit vindicated, by I said, essentially, this market is experimental. A lot of this stuff is, it's made to look like this, big fancy apparatus. And at the end of the day, it's, twigs and glue. And, now we're here.
That is really, really interesting because I think that in my experience working in news, after I learned about Bitcoin, I realized how little everyone in my industry knows about economics, which is really fundamental to what you said earlier. It's like understanding money, how money works, how our banking system works. Right now we've seen those charts of how confusing FTX was. It was like this web of all these different companies and it was a shell game. If you look at how the Federal Reserve and our banks work, it's the same. It's like the money printing is this mess of like all these different, offshoots of here from the Treasury to the Federal Reserve to the commercial banks. It's so confusing and no one understands it. And I think that that's why we don't have an informed public, because we don't have an informed media at all. And I wanted to ask you, because I know that when I went into journalism, part of it was I'm naturally curious. I wanted to learn a lot. I wanted to, interview people. I loved stories. But there was also an element for me where I felt like I wanted to hold the powerful accountable. So did you have that at all from your background as well? This idea of there's something unfair in the world. There's, sort of an us versus the elites. And I want to be on the side of, speaking out for the 99% and through my work. Did you have any feeling about that or any mission that was related to that?
Yeah, certainly. I would say I was highly motivated within the classic idea that journalism was supposed to be objective and that you were supposed to hold people accountable. And I think, for people who aren't familiar with my early history, I was part of the initial founding team over at CoinDesk. I was the first editor in chief there very early on. There were some days when I was the only person to publish on CoinDesk, right, which is funny now because it's such an institution with so many people around the world. But yeah, I really brought a very hard line to that coverage, and I felt early on that I was really interested in this idea of it being a public service, right? And I actually abstained from participating in, any of the cryptocurrencies economies. So so it was totally not involved in that. And I think part of it was to set the message that someone was going to take the market seriously, right? And I always said that was one of the things that I thought CoinDesk did well. Say what you will about their coverage now. I think, the people who were on that team early on, they cared about setting some precedent, right? Where it was, the people who, treating the people who were reading as if, they were making financial decisions and those financial decisions had consequences. So, play that through the years, and there was a lot that went, how that my thinking on that evolved. But yeah, essentially early on, there was a feeling that there needed to be a place that people could come and have a serious conversation about this, because really coming out of the 2013, bubble of that time, Bitcoin became the same thing we saw in the last cycle in 2021. Bitcoin became the hot story, became the thing that everybody, was on the bandwagon when it was going up. And then, you see the mainstream publications just stop covering it during the down. They totally write it off. It's left for dead. You get all the obituaries, but there was a sense even from, I think, the people who were staying in the market and myself, it was like, obviously this is not going away. Obviously this is still here, and people are still interested in the market. And it's very obvious that if you understand the technology in any way, even on a software level, that, these kind of mainstream opinions are totally irrelevant.
Right.
There was a sense of needing to have that place where people can be held accountable. It was a nice idea. I think in some ways I'm still fighting for that, in some ways. But yeah, it's tough to look at the mainstream media now, or even the crypto media, and just say, we haven't really come a long way, from that time. I think if you look at, my Twitter feed, a lot of it is, I post some old articles, from, how Bitcoin was covered in the past. And unfortunately, we just haven't really evolved. And I think part of it is, journalists suffer from these immense blinders about Bitcoin. And as you said, about money, right? And I think my point to the woman from the Financial Times was essentially, yes, you've lived your whole life in, Great Britain with, the Great British Pound. And, prior to the invention of Bitcoin, you never had a choice, in terms of and what, money you could choose and what your money stood for. Now you do. You undeniably live in a world where you can make that choice. And you can choose to align yourself with a more ethically sound money that you think is better for the world. So,
Right.
if you want to keep thinking that you are removed from choice, I think this is the ultimate thing at the end of the day. I think a lot of journalists really don't understand that they have choice. They don't understand that. And they don't understand that, to be objective, you can't really be objective anymore when it comes to money, I don't think, right? You do have a choice in the marketplace for money, because there is no longer a government that can impose money on you because of Bitcoin. So it changes the paradigm. And I think a lot of journalists they haven't woken up to that, and they haven't taken that question and asked themselves it seriously. I try to work one-on-one with people to get them to think about that question, because I think it's the most interesting question.
Was there a point when you went from Bitcoin and altcoins, Bitcoin and crypto, to just Bitcoin? And what was that journey for you?
Oh yeah, great question. So yeah, I think I'd like to say my Bitcoin maximalism was forged during the fork wars. I think for a long time within the industry, it was very unclear that Bitcoin was meaningfully different from other cryptocurrencies. So if you go back and you read through the old archives, you'll find that Bitcoin had a lead developer, it had a foundation. A lot of the ways that other alternative cryptocurrencies approach development is steeped in practices that were originally part of what Bitcoin was. So if you were to look at, what Bitcoin looked like in the early days, it looks a lot like what some of these other projects look like now. But, as someone who was following it closely, I think there were really kind of two there was a big schism in that era, right? Essentially, there were people who stopped being interested in Bitcoin, right? Everybody who was involved with Bitcoin was fighting. It was a total slog. You'd go to these conferences and grown men would be yelling at each other and they'd be crying about, various, software updates. And it was very hard to understand what they were talking about, the kind of like fights they were having. Like, you had to have a deep understanding. And then on the other side, you had the Ethereum folks come out and they're just printing money left and right. There are projects starting, they're raising, millions of dollars. So it was just this intellectual clusterfuck. Like, there's just no way to solve. There's no way to call it anything else. I don't know if you can swear on this program, but I like to say about the industry now, anybody who has a serious outlook on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, it's very likely that their opinion on it was shaped by 2017, the year. And to the extent that they have a novel opinion on it, it's based on what they think happened that year. And myself, I saw a crypto side of the industry that was increasingly super narcissistic, like not doing anything useful, raising hundreds of millions of dollars for things that they knew, were highly experimental without any ethical qualms about it. CoinDesk actually had a policy back then that, that we didn't cover any ICOs. You had to have a working software in order to get any coverage at all. Obviously, it wasn't effective because mainstream media came in and, was fanning the flames of a lot of this stuff. But was really hard to reconcile with. Honestly, there were times I almost quit the space because I was so repulsed by that.
Wow.
And then on the Bitcoin side, you had this very complex argument, really being had by a very small group of people all across the world, trying to make the best decision for a global money that they felt, could be designed in such a way that there was never, there was always going to be a choice for the individual, for the individual to enjoy maximum freedom when using the money, right? Ultimately, I'd probably sum it up at that. And I think coming out of that experience, and seeing so many people write off Bitcoin when I felt like the developers in the community made the right choice, that following the blow by blow of what had happened, was very hard. And I think, I did almost leave the industry. And I think I gave myself, a few months, after I left, because I did quit CoinDesk, and I spent, 3 or 4 months kind of not really doing anything. And I wanted to see if I could find any interest in Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies again. And I let myself kind of come back naturally. Actually, I wrote a thread I never published on this, but it was kind of written to the people who are quitting the crypto industry today.
Oh, wow.
And it was sort of like, give yourself time, let yourself find interest in it again, and do it passively. I went and visited old Bitcoin contacts. I didn't force myself to talk about Bitcoin. If it came up, I talked about it. People who I felt like could give me the right direction on what I should do. And ultimately, through that experience, I came to the conclusion that I had seen and participated in a certain part of Bitcoin that other people for the rest of kind of time would not have. And that I had a responsibility to do something with that, to try to make that knowledge from that period more accessible. And I don't think that I've wholly achieved that. But I still think that's what gives my work direction today. Because again, I was coming out of that experience. It was like, I feel for the people who are disenchanted by what's happening with FTX.
For sure.
But I think these kind of experiences are good for the industry, right? Mm-hmm. They're good for the people who are devoting their time and talents to it, because they force them to develop like the ethical calculus to navigate the industry. And clearly with Sam Bankman-Fried, I mean, you're, obviously this person not only didn't understand Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies in any significant way, had really no stakeholdership in the industry at all. Doesn't seem to have cared about anything. Good that he's gone. Hopefully he can get, his story can be a cautionary tale.
We're going to take a quick break from the show to hear these messages from my sponsors. First up, iTrustCapital. Do you save in Bitcoin for your retirement in your IRA? iTrustCapital allows you to invest in Bitcoin and other digital assets with the tax benefits of an IRA. And unlike the stock market, you can buy and sell 24 hours a day. Instead of paying taxes on Bitcoin gains every year, you can defer taxes using an iTrust crypto IRA, or with an iTrustCapital Roth IRA, you can withdraw tax-free at retirement. iTrust recently hit a milestone of $6 billion in total transactions across the platform, and that's $6 billion in tax-advantaged accounts that those 87,000 new IRS agents can't do anything about. The iTrustCapital platform is easy to use and only takes a few minutes to set up. And if you want to start investing with a $100 bonus, head to iTrust.capital/Natalie Brunell. Next up, let's talk about Bitcoin 2023. That is the biggest Bitcoin conference in the world. And take a look at the video from last year in Miami. It was an incredible event that was jam-packed with the best speaking sessions, workshops, and networking events that I've been to in the space. I had the chance to live anchor the Bitcoin Magazine news desk and serve as MC. And it was such a full circle moment for me to be at that conference, because the first one I attended was Bitcoin 2021 in Miami. And that's where I actually launched the Coin Stories podcast. I went on a media pass because I used to be a reporter, and I actually went backstage and started asking the speakers like Michael Saylor and Preston Pysh if they would come on my show. And they did. And a year later, I'm back at the conference as someone who actually has a career now in Bitcoin. So you never know what can happen at these events. I highly recommend going so you can meet other people that share the same values and passion for Bitcoin. And if you want your ticket at a 10% discount, head to b.tc/conference and use the code HODL, HODL. I'll see you there.
His story can be a cautionary tale.
Well, I think it's important to note that it was your former publication that broke this story. It was essentially, you know, the industry policing itself, and someone leaked. I mean, we still don't know who leaked that balance sheet to CoinDesk, right? But it was CoinDesk that put that story out that led CZ to, you know, make some announcements on Twitter, right?
Well, yeah, I think the cryptocurrency press, continues to do an admirable job in some ways, right? I think that, you know, personally, I helped hire Allison over at CoinDesk. He's another long tenured journalist. I mean, he's been reporting about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency stuff since 2014. But I think that's how you get success. And I think always, you know, that was my hope and aspiration for CoinDesk, was that it would be a place where, you know, experts and people who like understood the technology in a serious way, you know, could do good work, right? Ultimately, that's all we wanted, because, you know, prior to CoinDesk really being established, I mean, there was no cryptocurrency media really until like 2017. You know, all the companies were going out of business. You know, even my personal history at CoinDesk, you know, I joined a team of like 3 or 4. It grew to like 20 plus. It went down to me and another guy, and then it grew to like 50 people around the globe.
Wow.
And it went down again. You know, you're always kind of riding these cycles of the market. Where, you know, and it's very comparable to now, right? The difference is with each kind of market cycle, things get more developed. Like people stick around, you know, they develop acumen. And yeah, you know, a lot of like what I was trying to do at the end of my time at CoinDesk was really set it up to make the transition to be a serious news outlet. Because essentially, you know, for years, CoinDesk had kind of skated by on being, you know, a couple of things, like one, a news aggregator, and two, a place where, you know, people were able to do kind of good questions about technology, because CoinDesk was early on a technology publication. It's become a very much a markets publication. But yeah, you know, there was a team and an interest there in learning how to break news and devoting time and resources to that, because ultimately, I think like news is a useful societal function. Like, you know, news that actually moves markets. And I would talk a lot about this back then. It was essentially that, you know, if CoinDesk wasn't going to survive as an institution, or cryptocurrency journalism was to become useful, it would have to speak to the markets in some way. It would have to be useful for holding people accountable. And I think that's a success story, right? I mean, we'll hope that we can move forward from that, and it'll get better.
How did you end up at Bitcoin Magazine?
Yeah, great question. I've had a long-standing relationship with that team. You know, I was increasingly interested in Bitcoin, and we just sort of came together after a while. They told me about this conference they were putting on, Bitcoin 2021. They knew I had experience from working on that, and you know, it was kind of the rest was history on that. I think joined in late 2020. Helped get 2021 off the books. And you know, found myself at another media company when, you know, I didn't really know if that was going to be something that would interest me again. But again, I came from like sort of establishing my direction and mission, and really understanding that Bitcoin was the thing that I wanted to focus on, that it was the, you know, thing that you could rely on in an industry that is otherwise very disappointing.
Yeah, 2021 was my first conference, and it's funny because someone from the team sent me my media pass request from back then. Nice. It was probably like February 2021, and I hadn't launched my podcast or anything yet, but I requested a media ticket, and nice. Things changed since then, but no, yeah. I thought it was an amazing event that Bitcoin Magazine does a great job, and
that was the zeitgeist. That was probably the best conference I've ever been to in the whole industry.
Amazing.
That one was just lightning in a bottle. You know, COVID was ending, Bitcoin was surging, and that was the one where it really felt like the audience was like Bitcoin focused, and they were like booing people who were like, you know, mentioning other cryptocurrencies. That was the good audience. I feel like that conference of any of, you know, I've been to conferences for years since 2013, and it was that one felt like it really got it. But I think with conferences it's tough, right? You get like a lot of it's timing, a lot of it people have to want to have a good conference, right? The audience, people forget how much the audience is like important in a conference.
Yeah.
So we'll see
That
now that
was
we're in the bear
technically
market.
in the bull market. So yeah,
Yeah.
it was a fun event. I remember
This will be
that's
your first bear market, right? You're in your
this
first.
is well, it's not my first bear market as an investor because I came in
Mm.
2017. I first
Oh,
learned
okay.
about it back then while I was a local news reporter.
Mm,
And I rode that. I never sold. I rode that wave and I was like, what the heck is this thing? And I
mm.
wish I could tap myself on the shoulder back then, and tell myself to go down the rabbit hole because I was so skeptical and I just didn't take the time. And it does take a lot of time to really understand
You were
it.
one of the first generations
But
where there was a rabbit hole, though. Like the prior ones, like
yeah.
there wasn't a hole. There wasn't a hole. Like nobody had dug anything.
Amazing. Well, but so this is the perfect segue to what I want to talk to you about because you do so much extensive research and you have,
Mm,
especially on sort of the history of Bitcoin and the history of its pseudonymous creator.
mm. Yeah.
So Satoshi Nakamoto, let's talk about Satoshi for a
Mm,
little bit because we have this anniversary upon us of when he disappeared all these years ago.
mm.
Or he, she, they. But let's go
It's
back a little bit because I do think that this whole history and the cypherpunk movement and the decades really of research and development
mm,
that Satoshi stood on, right? Because it wasn't just something that kind of was invented or discovered in a vacuum. There was so much work that led up to it. And I think it's fascinating to read all about DigiCash and B Money
mm.
and Hash Cash and all of it. So I mean, maybe I'll just punt it to you and see where do you kind of want to start because
Yeah.
clearly you went all the way sort of to the beginning because you wanted to unpack this story and learn the characters that were so important to the foundation of Bitcoin. So where do you want to start with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can impart on why I think it's so useful. I mean, I think that, we're talking about now really establishing why Bitcoin is different from other cryptocurrencies and what it stands on. I think you have to start with the fact that, a digital cash or digital money, was a pursuit for 30 odd years before Bitcoin, because you really can't understand Bitcoin until you understand contextually, why it was an invention, why it actually, capital I, did something that was previously thought to be impossible, and had that kind of success. And I think that, as I kind of went towards trying to figure out how do I, help people understand that Bitcoin is categorically different from these other cryptocurrencies, you kind of have to start at the beginning there, and you really have to develop some sort of sense of scale and appreciation for what Satoshi did. And I think a lot of what the alternative cryptocurrencies today try to do is they very much try to chip away at that, right? A lot of their value propositions are based on assertions that they can do things that Bitcoin can't or shouldn't or will never do, or all these sorts of things. And that really changed the behavioral norms around these projects that existed for, decades prior. So I think, really, I find this conversation useful for education because I think, we have to understand what Satoshi did. And I think, almost he didn't even really invent money per se. He invented a way to distribute, for people to prove and distribute and manage a money collectively, right? It wasn't really that he invented some sort of money. It's that he invented a system that by which anyone kind of freely open and manage it, and that the distribution was fair, right? That people would actually accumulate something that they could value as money. So really understanding this process, I think, is key because, you do have these decades of failures, and then you have Bitcoin being a success. So really to understand why it was successful, like what particularly about it made it solve those problems, really gets to the point, I think, of why it's so different. And then I think, the Satoshi story is also just as fascinating, right? Because
Yeah.
the person who did this amazing thing, the person whose human achievement will probably go down in history, among the great innovators of the world, we know so little about. We don't know nothing about him, right? He does leave some digital trail that we can try to uncover and parse, and I've tried to do that. But he's not accessible in the way that we've come to expect from sort of, the great figures of the world, like a Steve Jobs or,
Yeah.
somebody who we can kind of humanize, right? In such a way. Because I think humans ultimately, we relate to people, we relate to stories. And that's why I think there is the story of Bitcoin, the technology, and why it's different. And then there's the story of Satoshi, the human being who achieves this thing. And I think those two stories combined, I think, are really fascinating. and they're a great entry point to just understanding the space as a whole. Because otherwise I think it can be very dense and technical and confusing. And, most cryptocurrency education is just marketing, right? So
Yeah.
you have to find a way to pass that.
Well, and I think that there's so much provenance in the fact that we don't know anything about, who Satoshi actually is, because in today's world, especially with our digital, social economy, we would dig into their whole past. We would judge them by their family. We would judge them by their partner. We would judge them by what they did in high school, right? And we would dig through it, and it would almost kind of, I think, tarnish the significance of Bitcoin. So I personally, I'm glad that we don't know, but at the same time, it's fascinating to sit there and be like,
it's amazing that you don't know, right?
Yeah.
So this is one of the things that I've tried to impress on people lately, and my work recently have kind of dug in, is like how just improbable it is that no one knows who he is, right? You're talking about the things that he would have had to do just because the way the internet is built, right?
Yeah.
So one of the fascinating things about the Satoshi story is Bitcoin really emerges from the failure of the internet, right? And so the internet is this, great communications protocol. We use it every day, but it's also this, place where identity is built in, where tracking, and surveillance kind of become part of it. And, as much as we've got the Assanges and Snowdens and the hacker culture that kind of rebuts that, Satoshi's almost like the great trespasser in that system. He finds some way to establish a digital identity around himself that is completely devoid of his real personage, right? And I think a lot of people don't appreciate how complex that would have been, right? Like we know now, I think that he was even sending like physical cash to ISP providers to, start the domain names, right? So like there are all the ways that Satoshi could have been caught. You almost want to think about him as, he's sort of if there's this great pyramid of the financial system, he's almost just like this expert burglar who like comes in the back door, goes through the vents and leaves without a trace. And, it's super miraculous because almost at every point, somebody should have been able to find him, right? Like in every conversation that you have on the internet, your IP is revealed. When you establish a domain name, like he did for Bitcoin with bitcoin.org, he could have exposed himself there. There are countless situations, like when he was on the email, he had to create an email address to interact on the mailing list. So there's all these kind of points in the Bitcoin launch where just one slight error from Satoshi, like one random fingerprint that he left on the glass, could have completely doxed him.
Yeah.
And it's just really amazing that it hasn't, right? And that his mystery has stood the scrutiny now of 14 years, right? So
insane. I know the OPSEC. I can't believe, obviously, whoever they are, they must have known just how significant this all could be, and how the identity could potentially ruin what is this amazing organic form of money that's now unstoppable and bulletproof as a network. So let's talk about what we do know about Satoshi Nakamoto. Like when was the first, when did Satoshi first surface? What blog or what website was it? And how, so you're essentially saying that there was no fingerprint, like there's never an IP address that could be tied to a location?
No, well, yeah. So Satoshi really surfaces in the summer of 2008. This is a point where he starts his internet life, right? Both by registering emails and signing up for the cypherpunk mailing list, which is essentially the email list that he'll eventually release the Bitcoin white paper on. But we know that he starts private correspondences with people who are of note from that community. He attempts to kind of. Yep. Adam Back being one. And I think there are several others who kind of admitted to some early correspondence with him, circulating this idea for a digital cash project. But then he starts the infrastructure, right? So he starts registering the domain names for bitcoin.org, really starting to put this project together because, the other thing about Satoshi, apart from being an inventor, he does have to run an open source project, right? So he does have to, take on this role almost as like an entrepreneur or, bootstrapper of this organization, right? So he starts to do that, and then in the fall of 2008, he really starts this conversation on the cypherpunk mailing list, where he debuts the white paper and attempts to engage in conversation around this idea called Bitcoin. There's a massive pushback against this idea. But largely from a very educated group, right? From the very same people who have, like Hal Finney for 20 years been trying to approach this problem, they've kind of seen it all before. And there's this back and forth that, is really so verbose that they ended up getting kicked off the list, right? So essentially the people who were talking about Bitcoin, they were too bothersome to the rest of the cypherpunk folks. And the moderator essentially steps in and says, okay, like enough with this Bitcoin conversation, like take it elsewhere. From which, he then goes to what seems like then work on the code, right, to actually kind of release something for Bitcoin. And then, of course, we have January 3rd, 2009, where he, starts the Genesis block, starts building the blockchain that will eventually be released on January the 9th. And Bitcoin is sort of, birthed to the world and released as a software that anyone can download. But yeah, through that entirety process of both, connecting with other, signing up for services like emails or domain names in which, you would have to potentially give identifying information. He has not given any identifying information to the extent that he maybe tripped something to one of these individuals he talked to. Certainly none of that has come out. And then he goes through the paces of, essentially for 2 years running the Bitcoin project as its, principal software developer, right? So he's releasing patches, releasing updates, and a lot of this correspondence is online. The Wall Street Journal kind of published his original correspondence with Hal Finney, where in the first few days, they're patching bugs, going back and forth, sending the first transactions. One of the funny things about that is it's sort of a weekend. These two guys are kind of doing this obscure thing by themselves, and just how quickly they're talking to each other. Within hours, they're at their emails, they're constantly fiddling with this thing, and just to even get Bitcoin stable, something that other people can run, would have been a feat. It seems like he was also in the background, sort of propping up the network, so he would have been mining some of the blocks and ensuring that Bitcoin wasn't, because at that stage it was vulnerable to attack. One of the interesting, intellectual kind of puzzles, I think, is, really when does Bitcoin become decentralized? At what point is Bitcoin a quote decentralized money? If that is what distinguishes it from all other forms of money, when does it meet that criteria? My personal opinion is that it's not until much later, after Satoshi leaves, because he's so mission critical to the entire design for his tenure. So you got some really interesting questions to dig in there about, how Bitcoin functions, how it functioned back then. And, from what we know about Satoshi, he's certainly someone who wasn't willing to let this thing fail. And I think by understanding this timeline, we can understand how purposeful he is, because I think one of the main attack vectors from alternative cryptocurrency crowd is I think they will try to kind of, paint Bitcoin as something that was, just an experiment, or he could have tried all these things. He was just another guy trying this thing, and why can't we? Like blah blah blah. Satoshi was someone who took this very seriously. He took all aspects of the design seriously, and ultimately, in the many ways that he could have been identified or caught, or the network could have failed, he was able to subvert all those things, from what we can tell.
Yeah.
And that, I think, really is a story that is only going to become more unbelievable over time, right? And I think that's another thing about the Bitcoin story that is, going back to the kind of the journalism and mainstream things we were talking about, is the Bitcoin story is unbelievable. It will continue to be unbelievable because it is objectively unbelievable that someone achieved this thing. And I think the more we can unbelieve it, the more we can cast doubt on some of these other things, right? Is we have to understand really just like how immense the challenge was.
Did Satoshi come up with the name Bitcoin?
He appears to have, because he purchased the domain name, and that's what he named the white paper. Though it does seem that he did that very late in the process. There's some evidence that he circulated a white paper that was just called Digital Cash, where I think it might have been Digital Cash. And there was somebody who this year found that on the same service where he registered the domain name for Bitcoin.org, there was netcoin.org was also registered the day before. So there's some speculation, he may have just had a bad grab bag of names. There was a funny one yesterday. I found that Hal Finney actually proposed calling Digital Cash Crash, which for crypto cash was his favorite one. He liked Crash.
We're going to take another quick break to hear these messages from my sponsors. First up, Fold. Fold is the best Bitcoin rewards debit card and shopping app in the world. You can earn Bitcoin on everything you purchase, from Amazon to your groceries, with Fold's Bitcoin Cashback debit card, and win free Satoshis every day, or even a whole Bitcoin by spinning the daily wheel and the purchase rewards wheels. I actually have an alarm set every single day so that I never miss out on spinning the daily wheel and earning free sats. And, I have to say that Fold is one of the best ways to get someone completely new into Bitcoin because they can start earning it and learning about it and using it. So if you want to sign up and join the fun, head to foldapp.com/Natalie for 5,000 in free sats. All right, now I want to tell you about a company called CrowdHealth, which is a Bitcoin-enabled alternative to health insurance. Because let's be honest, the government and insurance companies have jacked up prices. They've made things super complex. And when you send your money in, it essentially goes into the health insurance black hole, and then you never see it again, even if you don't get sick and you don't need medical services because, you don't eat fiat foods. But then if you actually do get sick or you need care, you have to send them more money because something ends up not being covered. The great news is there's now an alternative brought to you by Bitcoiners, and it is called CrowdHealth. It is very different from insurance. Instead of sending your hard-earned money to an insurance company, you hold your money in an account that CrowdHealth helps you set up. And you can even convert the dollars in your account to Bitcoin. Now, the company is all about community. Remember, it's called CrowdHealth. So when someone in the community is in need, needs care, needs help, you can choose to actually use the money in your account to help them, or you can keep it in your account. And if you ever leave CrowdHealth, you can take the money that's left with you. If you want to learn more and sign up, you can head to joincrowdhealth.com/Natalie. Now back to the show.
Like Crash, which is not a
and
a
so
great name.
back then, the first blocks that were mined, the subsidy was 50 Bitcoin, right? So they were going into this wallet that's still associated with Satoshi Nakamoto that has like 1 million coins. Is that correct?
Well, that's a little speculative. So now you're getting into like Satoshi, the studies of Satoshi on the blockchain. So you sort of have to rely on some other authorities other than myself for that, who essentially posit that what was happening was that Satoshi essentially, understood that the network would be subject to attack because, the kind of crucial blockchain attack is a 51% attack, right? So if you have if you lose the majority who's running it, it could be attacked and subverted. So if there's like 5 guys running it, you only need 3 bad actors, right? So for some period, Satoshi is running enough, hardware equipment, it seems, to keep the network stable and operational and, as intended, and the theory is essentially that you can tell that there are these unique blocks that have this kind of interesting signature in it. And you can see that this type of miner that's mining them kind of tapers off over time. And the theory here is that essentially, he almost had like a set of training wheels on the Bitcoin bike, right? So essentially every time it tipped over, kind of hit one of the Satoshi wheels. And then he would essentially power down his mining over time as more people came and collectively ran the software. But I think, as I said, that was kind of the riddle initially, is that, Satoshi launches Bitcoin, but it's essentially an incomplete project at that point because it isn't really decentralized at that point by any meaningful way. I mean, it is decentralized in that anyone theoretically could have solved the blocks and claimed the Bitcoins and used Bitcoin in the way he intended. But the network was so fragile at that point, that it's easy to imagine somebody like, going over and like kicking over his little block tower and, the whole thing. He would have maybe had to restart it, and there's even like an email early on where he posits, he says something like, well, we don't know if we're going to have to restart it at some point, and like try this again. Right. So even he like didn't know that he would get it right on the first time. And, it's really Hal, who's the first Bitcoin user, I think, who comes to Bitcoin with a lot more optimism, right? Satoshi is more of an inventor, more of someone who I think labored over something and was very aware of like all of the defects, and almost like I think one of the things that makes him so challenging is that he doesn't bring that optimism to the project, right? He's not relatable on those grounds. I think he was someone who appreciated the gravity of what he wanted to do, but really had the mentality of like I've got to see this through.
Okay, well, I want to hear a little bit more about just the history of Bitcoin. And I think for a lot of people, it might be helpful if you could maybe summarize the importance of sort of the things that came before, because it wasn't Satoshi who invented proof of work. That came before, but Satoshi did invent the difficulty adjustment, which is just, I think, one of the most brilliant things about Bitcoin. And also this idea of, when was the Byzantine generals problem solved? Can you talk a little bit about sort of those earlier projects and how Satoshi built on them, which made Bitcoin into something truly unique and powerful?
Yeah, I maybe have a different slant on this than most people. I think that digital cash was really solved in the 1980s by David Chaum. So one of the interesting things is that, if you think about digital cash, it's separate from the apparatuses that go into making it. It is just something, it is a general term that could have been satisfied by a number of means. And one of the interesting things is that, early on within the digital cash space, one of the original kind of progenitors was David Chaum. And essentially, he did figure out how to make a working electronic cash through this concept called blind signatures. So essentially, he did solve the double spend problem, but you sort of needed a system ultimately where there was some hierarchy. You needed someone being a bank or a merchant and a user, and these were all very distinctive roles. So I think David Chaum is interesting because if you view him as someone who created digital cash, well, then the question is, well, why did it take so long to get to Bitcoin for digital cash to actually exist in the market? And I think, the technical definition of creating digital cash wasn't enough. It had to have been Bitcoin. And so then you can kind of look at David Chaum's failures. So, one of them was essentially this design schematic where there was different roles. Different people had different permission statuses, and he baked that into the design. The other part is that he patented his main invention, which is the blind signature. So essentially for 25 years from 1983 or something like that, no one else could build or iterate with this, idea. So the cypherpunks who were also trying to realize digital cash, they had this thing they could use, but they were legally prevented from doing that. One of the funny things about Bitcoin is that if you map the date when Satoshi started working on Bitcoin, he would have started after the Chaum patent had expired. So it was something that really kind of chilled the rest of the digital cash industry and sort of, set this tone where it's like, okay, this guy created it, he solved it, but we're gonna have to wait for him to do it because he owns the legal permissions to this, right? So it wasn't really until the mid 90s where you really see David Chaum's company struggle financially. They're unable to get off the ground. He's trying to sell the software to banks, right? He wants banks to commercially operate the software. So you move away from this idea where, the network has these permissioned roles to essentially having a decentralized network. This is really where it comes from, where you can have a peer-to-peer alternative. So one of the reasons the cypherpunks become interested in peer-to-peer software is they don't need David Chaum's permission to do it. So all of the kind of tinkering now kind of moves over to, oh, well, okay, rather than having a merchant and a bank and a user and them all having sort of separate permissions, everyone can be the same and everyone can be equal. So they really then kind of moved to saying, okay, we solved digital cash, but we needed all these different entities. Now we can make everybody the same. But then how does the economy develop, right? So then Adam Back kind of comes in the late 90s, and he really figures out that, rather than backing a digital cash with an existing commodity like a gold or cash or something like that, you can back it with a computer commodity. Essentially, computers have their own resources, RAM, memory, all these sorts of different things, proof of work, ability to do calculations. So essentially, really by the late 90s, they're very close. They have a bunch of these pieces. They have digital cash can work. It needs to be peer-to-peer. And they're like, oh, okay, but we can back it with this, with something that has to do with computers. And what's funny is even though they're kind of there at 1997, it takes a full 11 years for Satoshi to kind of come in and really underpin it with economics. Because the part that, Adam Back left off and he really couldn't solve with Hashcash is there was no way to stop the currency from just going to zero over time, because essentially what would happen is, computers were getting cheaper over time. So if you were backing the currency with how fast your computer was, then every year would just proportionally, it would be a bad money, right? It would be effective digital cash and that you can send it peer to peer, but it, wouldn't you. So Satoshi really, he solves that very small economics piece, right? How do you get people to fairly compete to create this money, and then how does that economy self-regulate? And so yeah, I think he has the most important contribution, but it's kind of a interesting tale how it kind of all comes together. There's many people who are very close, and by all rights, it was something that could have existed decades before, but it really is the specific failure of each idea, and it just kind of left one little thing. And I think that again, that's what's so remarkable about Hal, and I really push back on the idea that Hal is Satoshi. I've become a really big anti Hal Satoshi guy, because I think that one of the things that makes Hal such a great first user is you have to understand that if he's someone who spent 30 years trying to achieve something, and then he became Satoshi's super fan when Bitcoin is released, that means he has so much humility that he spent his entire life failing to do something, and he was willing to champion the guy who did it. The kind of person that I think you would have to be, the kind of humility and there's the ability to recognize excellence in someone else and not act like petty. It was so easy for Hal to be like, F that guy. I'm not going to use his project, because he did it. But then he didn't do that, right? He supports Satoshi with all of his human energy. And I personally, I find that pretty romantic of the thought. So yeah,
What was Hal's contribution before Bitcoin? It was what did he do with proof of work? It was
reusable proof of work. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. I almost think that Hal's contribution to the whole tale is really just his steadfast interest in it. He's almost like I've actually now read the cypherpunk mailing list like linearly through Hal's contributions.
Wow.
He's almost the only one who sticks with it, and he's always the first guy to try everyone's thing. So going back to 1990, he really curates a lot of discussion around the mailing list. He is the first one to kind of go back in the archives and read about economics. And he's like, oh, hey, they used to back the US dollar with gold and this is how it worked. So he's kind of writing these long things. And then, Satoshi isn't even the first anonymous digital cash creator Hal would have interacted with. There was a couple other people on the list who put out proto Bitcoins. There was one called I can't remember the names of them now. I'm blanking, but there's a couple small projects that are they literally announce them and 2 days later they figure out there's a horrible bug with them and they don't work. So Hal's the first guy who keeps the idea going. And I think that's really his role within the whole tale, is that he was so close each time. He was right there. He was the first user. And yeah, I don't know. I think that's why I like Hal's role as the first user, so maybe if you're
well, I'm smiling because I
know you're a big Hal Satoshi fan. Yeah.
No, I obviously don't know as much as you do because you've been in that rabbit hole for a long time. But okay, so clearly you must have at some point thought Hal is likely to be Satoshi. So tell me about why you thought that and why that changed for you.
Yeah, I think because why I thought that originally is because he's so core to the story. He is the one who keeps that flame burning. And there's just so much to the extent that we even really can currently tell the story about digital cash. A lot of it is because of Hal's personal commitment to that. But again, I think I go back to it where it's, if he is not Satoshi, then then Hal's reaction to Bitcoin becomes so much more personal. It really becomes, oh, well, someone else beat me to this, right? Imagine spending your whole life trying to achieve something and then just not being the guy. There's whole movies where this is the entire subplot, right? Which is the other guy is trying to foil the other guy, because he did the thing. And I just think that the reason that Hal is such an important character in the story, is that, he has all these values that are just so, standing up for the right thing and being vocal, and not, he's anti-government, but he's not willing to bend the rules. Hal is this interesting character where he almost grounds the Bitcoin story. He's so essential for the Bitcoin story.
But isn't okay. I've read a little bit about Hal. Isn't it Hal Finney who had a neighbor named Satoshi Nakamoto?
Oh, did he? I don't. Yeah, that would be interesting. I know that he lived near the fake Dorian Nakamoto.
Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto was the name of the neighbor apparently in this neighborhood that he lived in. And so I'm just what are the chances? And it's funny because going back to, earlier we talked about being a reporter or whatever. In my time when I was a general assignment, I did cover a lot of crime. Obviously, a lot of crime happens, if it bleeds, it leads. We covered all the local murders, and I've watched my share of the murder documentaries. It's always kind of the obvious person, and people try to go down different paths. And certainly that happens in the court cases. But it's always the husband, it's always the obvious one that you try to get swayed away from. And so for me, I always come back to this, there are these very simple things, including what you're saying. I mean, the fact that Hal was talking about the economic side to it, the history of money and what money is. And the fact that it seems like he was genuinely just a good guy. I recently watched an interview with his wife. He just seems like such a good guy. I hope Satoshi, whoever Satoshi is this good, wholesome family guy. And I remember reading the last message that Hal wrote on one of the blogs saying, I'm comfortable with my legacy is I think what he said. He got very sick. He passed away. His kids, obviously had they knew where his Bitcoin was and all of that. And I'm sure he passed it down to them. But just that simple phrase of like, I'm comfortable with my legacy.
Mm.
I think it's bigger than his family legacy personally, but
Mm.
we don't have to go into my own.
Yeah. Well, that's the great thing. I always say the only reason to have a real theory about who Satoshi is to tell some story that makes people understand Bitcoin better. And I think that's the
Yeah.
thing with Hal, right? Is he grounds the Bitcoin story in a relatable way because his values are truly like good and American, I would say, like classically,
Yes.
American in the way that they, he was never, and like, this comes out through his cypherpunk, his dealings with the other cypherpunks. He was always principled. He was always willing to, dispute someone else if he felt like they were wrong. He was ultimately someone who, other people would want to be and model model themselves after. So I think, like Hal has that role in the story, even if he wasn't Satoshi, he has that role, right? He
Yeah.
is able to ground the story in an important way. I just like to throw it out there that if he's not, I do think that he has even greater values than I thought originally. So,
By the way, I just looked up on Wikipedia. Finney lived in the same town for 10 years as Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto in Temple City, California.
mm.
Just saying.
the
Anyway,
plot thickens.
one thing that I do think kind of sways you maybe in a different direction is that Genesis block and having Chancellor on the brink of second bailout, right? It would sort of make you think that this person might be in the UK, and there's speculation that it
I
might
mean,
be
the
some
other thing I
folks.
would say is like, as a writer, like I've tried to write dialogue, like in order to write conversations like back and forth between two people, like it would be very hard to fake those kind of things, I think. And
True.
it's so you would have to presuppose, if you think Hal and Satoshi are the same person, that Satoshi was both a savant at like computer software and digital cash, but that he was
OPSEC, yeah.
also so good at writing emails that he could create characters that had authentic interactions with each other without the other people on the mailing list realizing that it was a fake.
Right.
So that's another thing where it's like, but we know that he like duped everybody else, with all the internet stuff. So,
Well, with that headline from the London Times, do we have any idea what times of the day Satoshi was more active? Was it
mm.
likely the a US time zone or overseas?
Yeah, I think there's some studies on that. I think that there's some assertion that he was around and like mostly active in Pacific time, which again supports the Hal theory. I think the problem with that is that if programmers, that they work at odd hours. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
they're a mostly nocturnal bunch. So trying to pin them down on that stuff, may not be super useful. But look, I think that the Satoshi story will certainly live on, and like with the Netcoin example, we might find nuggets here and there
Yeah.
where we can learn a little bit more.
It is really, really fascinating how good Satoshi was at OPSEC to cover
Mm.
every single possible track with how advanced technology is and how great some people are at forensic analysis and looking into something like, who this person was, where were they writing? Can you talk a little bit about the disappearance, so to speak, because
Yeah.
that anniversary obviously being upon us? When did we last hear from Satoshi and what happened around that? Because wasn't there also something about the government at one point, getting in touch or
Yeah.
trying to get in touch with who was working on Bitcoin?
Right. Yeah. So we're coming up on the anniversary of December the 12th, which is, Satoshi's, disappearance from Bitcoin. So this is really when he, to the extent that he is the dictator and king of Bitcoin, lays down the crown, right? Essentially emails the other developers and says, hey, somebody else step up, I'm leaving. And really writes his last post on Bitcoin Talk. So really kind of makes his final update to the software before he departs. And yeah, I think it's interesting because now you get into the period, December 12th is really the kickoff of, the Satoshi departure season, where this is where the mystery of Satoshi leaving really comes, which I think is in many ways kind of one of the most formative times in Bitcoin. Essentially the leader and creator decides to abdicate, and then through that there's this really strange, equally mysterious story of how the developer team forms and then soldiers on without him. So on December the 12th he writes his last email, and then on December the 17th we have a man by the name of Gavin Andresen, a mid 40s suburban dad, agrees to kind of take over the helm from him. And then through sort of April of 2011, Satoshi is still around and having some backroom dialogue with the developers, but thereafter completely disappears. And the thereafter part is more interesting because it follows, one of the appearances of the core developers at a CIA conference. So, Gavin Andresen famously goes to the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, and gives a presentation about Bitcoin to the various three-letter agencies. And thereafter goes on a web show where he, doesn't really dismiss the claim that that might be one of the reasons Satoshi left, right? So he sort of leaves that lingering thread that's, potentially a reason. And, thereafter that day.
That Satoshi left, why?
Well, so there's a couple theories, right? So in December, as that conversation's really heating up, a couple things are happening. So one, the users are getting much more involved and the project's just becoming very complex, right? So there's a lot of things happening in just different aspects of the technology and the community and all that stuff. And one of the things that happens is there's a community effort to get WikiLeaks to accept Bitcoin. So WikiLeaks at that point would have been the most notorious, group in the world. They would have just published videos the year prior of the U.S. government, military killing civilians in the Iraq and Afghani war. And the user efforts to get WikiLeaks to accept Bitcoin famously spooks Satoshi. He says, this is going to kick the hornet's nest and the swarm will head toward us. And, that's one of his last messages to the public Bitcoin users. And then thereafter, right, we sort of get the period where he sort of transitions out and his ultimate exit, his ultimate kind of lack of dialogue with anyone kind of comes as Gavin Andresen, the new lead developer, decides to visit the CIA and have that conversation with them about what is Bitcoin, right? So yeah, there is this narrative about, the government encroaching on Bitcoin and Satoshi leaving in a way that suggests that he was, fearful of the government response to Bitcoin having been a success. So
Wow, that is fascinating. In your research of this whole space and this character of Satoshi, what's been the thing that has surprised you the most? Or that or that still has you just going, I need to keep digging into this aspect of it?
Yeah, I think that Bitcoin is ultimately like a pretty unique project because essentially, as I said, Bitcoin has these riddles that it has to solve. And one of these things is that, Bitcoin needs to be a non-government money, right? That is essentially what Bitcoin is a money controlled by the people, but that has no government. And so then you get into like, what is government? Like, what is that, right? And so we're taught to kind of think that government is a state, like it's an official, apparatus and administration that presides over some geographic, border. But in reality, is that really a state, right? Like, is that what defines what governance is? And I think the interesting thing is that, Satoshi kind of leaves this open riddle. I don't think he knew how to make Bitcoin a non-government currency because essentially, like at the point that Satoshi is still around, it's a monarchy. Satoshi makes all the decisions. Like that is the government is him, and then he relinquishes the government. So he sort of leaves Bitcoin with this open question, but it's a very important question because it's actually very core to what Bitcoin is and if it will succeed, right? So if Bitcoin, at very many points in the Bitcoin history, I think it could have become just a currency with another government. And the way that I think most cryptocurrencies now are just cryptocurrencies with other governments. There's some, a lot of them even tout that they have governance. That is like a specific thing that they talk about. They talk about how they make decisions, how groups of them make decisions, how majorities of those people make decisions, and then, enforce those decisions on other people. And so Bitcoin doesn't have that, right? Bitcoin has managed to, over 14 years, become divorced from that. You as an individual can run Bitcoin and no one can infringe on your ability to do that. You're able to kind of freely pick any software that has ever been released, call it Bitcoin, and run Bitcoin. That is categorically different from how any of the other cryptocurrencies work, because I think they fell into this trap of not understanding that question. It's like, how do you create a non-government currency? And most of them just created governments around it with extra steps. And I think that what's interesting is that in the Bitcoin story, there were also many instances where Bitcoin could have done that. Bitcoin also was very close to having some sort of governance or apparatus around it, and thereby maybe almost failing. So it sort of gets to this question of, can we create a non-government currency? If there is one, I think it is Bitcoin. But then we're also dealing with the fact that, like, there are all these humans involved in Bitcoin, and humans are really great at messing things up, right? So I think the real drama really comes, thereafter, where it's, there are people who made decisions that I think could have potentially caused Bitcoin to fail, but then, through the drama of the industry, it succeeded. But yeah, it all comes from Satoshi, right? So he leaves I don't think Satoshi really completes Bitcoin. I don't think that's what I think he made like 90% of it. But then there's that 10% where it's, and again, I go back to the two questions where it's, when Satoshi was around, was Bitcoin decentralized, and did it have no governance? And I think that the answer to both of those questions is, like, ultimately, like, very debatable. Like, it wasn't decentralized because he, in many ways, like, acted in a way that bootstrapped the network, and it didn't lack governance because he was, essentially there and had the keys, right? He was the only one who could push changes. So, if we are to believe that Bitcoin, has succeeded becoming this special thing, that it almost has succeeded in spite of Satoshi, and that I think is very interesting, then we need to sort of understand this other rich kind of tapestry of, like, characters and figures that then comes after and sort of inherits these problems, but then have to, like, really deal with untangling them, and to realize that a great number of people, like, went in the other direction, and they just created other pseudo government currencies.
Yeah. Well, knowing the history of Bitcoin as well as you do, how do you explain to people that go, I don't understand, it's open source code that can be copied. Why can't there just be another Bitcoin? If enough people get on the train and decide, you know what, we're going to start a new one right now. Like, why is Bitcoin so special that it can't be replicated?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I mean, a lot of these things, it's like, like, I think my attempt to do it is the best that I know how, and I'm well happy to be a Hal Finney and support anyone who has a better idea. I think that, I've tried to educate and continue writing about the early parts of Bitcoin history. I want to produce more writing, though it's been very slow. It's just really hard. I think ultimately the thing is that you have to realize that, and this is where I think the Bitcoin education, I think, can go a little wrong. I think most, like, people who are well-intentioned, like, intellectually, like, they will explore other cryptocurrencies at some point. And I think, we've done a disservice by, I think, not talking to those people directly. I think we try to shame them and sort of shun them away from Bitcoin. And I just don't think that that's a great strategy, because I think that ultimately, most people are not going to read a list of principles and then just follow those principles, and they're not going to question things. People are naturally inquisitive. They're naturally going to not trust other people. And if they're given a very strong recommendation, I mean, I don't know about you personally, but my inclination is usually to doubt that, and then kind of go on my own journey to discover that. So one of the reasons I think I believe in writing about this time period is, ultimately, I think, like, you have to give people the ability to come to their own realizations, like, to come to the information on their own terms. That is very important. And I think, like, as long as that maintains, like, as long as that's an open question, I think we're always going to struggle, like, with Bitcoin, because I think we become very good at explaining how we think Bitcoin is. And I think for people who accept explanations and can, like, do the diligence to check that is effective. But I think we haven't become good at letting them have the tools to figure that out, other than just, like, going to these gambling crypto casinos and getting rights. And then eventually,
is there like a go-to book that talks about the history of Satoshi and the origins of Bitcoin? Or
no, there definitely is not. Work in progress.
Working on that?
I'm as fast as I can. I'm trying to get that out. But no, yeah, I mean, I would hope to produce something at some point. Can't comment on that more specifically. For now, I think I can only defer to the best book out there, which is the Bitcoin Standard. So
what is your favorite Satoshi Nakamoto quote?
Oh, geez. I actually think Satoshi is really, like, unquotable. That's, like, one of the things about him is he's just he has a really bad turn of phrase. What's my favorite Satoshi quote? That's a good question. I'm gonna stumble on this one because you're catching me, huh?
I think mine is the one, either get some in case it catches on, or wasn't he the one that also
you're
said,
right, yeah.
if you don't get it, I don't have time to explain it to you.
Yeah,
That's
not
a
one of
good.
my favorite Satoshi quotes. I think that's like a reason why I think Satoshi's not super quotable. Trying to think like what. I mean, the best thing that I think Satoshi ever wrote was like his introduction to the P2P Foundation like forum, where he talks about why he created Bitcoin, but really like that's the closest he gets to like a colloquial explanation. I honestly feel like Satoshi, like one of the real tragedies of him and like why, again, like why has Hal is so important, like because Hal can talk in a way where people understand it, and Satoshi is like, you look at the quotes that we have from Satoshi, like some of them are real bad. Like they're not they're not going on kitchen magnets like anytime soon. Like even the good ones, like the, if it catches on, and there's the other one where it's like, oh, the technology is set in stone, but like they're very like crusty. I'm a
Mhm.
writer at the end of the day. I like pithy sayings, so I
Yeah,
don't know. I think like Satoshi, I just find very unquotable. And just, that's one of the things that makes him, I think, lovable though, in such a way. Like he couldn't, I mean, imagine if you created a thing and then he has to try to explain this thing, right? That he just can't like, he has to
right,
get you to understand it in some way. And
right.
then, can't do that, right? Well, he does have the quote where, trying to explain these things is bloody hard. Maybe that's my favorite Satoshi quote, because I think it's the most real, where he's like, he basically says, uh, yeah, I think it's trying to explain this to newcomers is bloody hard or something like that.
Do you think that Satoshi is alive or dead?
Yeah, interesting question. Hmm. It's hard to imagine him being alive. Uh, because then it's like you're forced with like realizing that this individual is still alive today, and he's like alive right now. And then is just choosing to kind of not be involved in the thing that he created. That's like hard for me to rationalize, I think. Because I think he would have had to have put so much effort into Bitcoin.
Hmm.
It's hard for me seeing him being so divorced from that. Um, I don't know how we'll ever answer that question, right? I think if he was, I think, the evidence that he's dead, seems to be a lot stronger, right? Like he hasn't
Right,
sold any Bitcoin
right.
that we know of.
So
So yeah,
that wallet address is like people can look
well,
that
so there
wallet
is no
up.
real wallet address. So that's like the one of the tough things. So because he mined from like different
Uh-huh.
computers, there was some way where he did it where he like split his he was essentially running with like more sophisticated computers. But it seems like he was mining different addresses, and it's really like the way that they know and they can approximate some amount is that there is these miners that have these different like you'd have to Sergio Lerner is kind of the expert in this, but there's essentially like some sort of fingerprints within the hashing that they can identify, and that's how they know that they're somewhat
Wow.
related. And so there isn't like, yeah, I also thought this too for a while. I was like, oh, there just like must be an address with like a million
Yeah.
Bitcoin sitting in it, but there isn't. So he was like reusing addresses and having multiple addresses, right? So there isn't like one Satoshi wallet, which means that, the only way we really know these addresses kind of work is they're sort of clustered with this identifier, and we think we know how much he has, but in reality we actually really don't even know. There's only one instance that I've ever found, and this was only given to me by like another early Bitcoiner, that like Satoshi even admits like owning Bitcoins like at all. There's one reply he gives to a guy where he says like this guy basically mailed him let him know of some bug, and Satoshi said, oh, okay, I'll fix that, and he said, oh, I'll give you some Bitcoins, and Satoshi was like, oh, I have plenty of Bitcoins.
Uh,
So he sent me that email, and so that's the only thing I've ever like actually found of like Satoshi owning Bitcoins, because otherwise there's really like, because of the way that Bitcoin works, like without you proving that you own a private key,
and
is there a way to.
is there a reason that Satoshi chose 21 million as the total supply? Why 21
Yeah.
million?
Yeah, my favorite theory about 21 million is that it's related to blackjack. And so 21 is essentially the, if you ever played the gambling game blackjack. So like there's one part of this code that's notable. So within the original Bitcoin code, there was a gambling application like in it. So there was apparently Satoshi thought at some point that you'd be able to gamble with Bitcoin or something. So it's funny to think of Satoshi as a bit of a gambler. And I think, when you explain game theory, I think like poker and like, gambling games like actually
Yeah.
work. I actually tried this with someone recently. They were like, well, how does I know what this is a Bitcoin? Or, I was like, well, it's like, you sit down and you play poker. How do you know it's poker? You know that there are rules, right? So this is a part of game theory. So yeah, it's in blackjack, 21 is essentially, you win automatically if you get 21. So I like to think that 21 million is like his blackjack on the system. It's like he knew it was so good. 21 million. It's like he
Wow.
wins, and like it's that's why he chose the number, because it seems like there was a range of numbers that he could have chosen. I think Jameson Lopp published some stuff about this where there's it's constrained a bit by the amount of digits like actually in the space. Like there's only a certain number of well, I'm probably not going to explain this well, but essentially there's like a range of possible numbers based on the certain like amount of digits that it could have possibly been. And it's this, range where you could have chosen any number. And so I like 21 because yeah, gambling and you win, right? It's the ultimate, like, I beat the system. And on in that view, it's kind of like a real it's like a real G move from Satoshi, just being
Yeah.
like, I win, bang, here you go.
We all
Um,
win with Bitcoin.
you
All
kind
right.
of picture him doing some sort of like hand signal, like on the way out,
I love it. I've loved
Yeah.
talking to you. You're just such a wealth of knowledge. I know we've been going for a while now. So to just wrap up, I guess where I want to leave this and what I want to ask you is there's still so much before us. I feel like we're in that phase right now of now they fight us, and we still have an uphill battle when it comes to governments not wanting to relinquish their power, their monopoly on money and what comes with it. So do you see any legitimate maybe threats to Bitcoin that keep you
Oh
up
yeah.
at night and that you think about? Or are you on the side where you're like, no, my conviction is strong that no matter what happens in the, fiat denominated price right now in the bear market, this thing's going to take over. It's the future. We're going to be all, accounting everything in sats and Bitcoin.
Yeah, well, I have a saying. I say every day I like to reduce my confidence in Bitcoin, and every day I find it only grows stronger. So I happen to be a bit like puritanical in my view. This is Joseph Poon once called me a bit of a Bitcoin Puritan, which is essentially I think that we have to go through the greatest amount of suffering like in order to be successful, and that the amount of suffering that you go through will sort of be equal to success. So yeah, I think we need to understand that. Yeah, it's going to take time for people to understand Bitcoin. I think there are massive things that we could there's massive hardships that we could go through going forward, and I think it behooves us to like think about them mentally. I think within my lifetime I think I'm pretty convinced that the state will take over the crypto system. Like the best way for the state to attack Bitcoin is to subvert the cryptocurrency system at large. I think this is if we I think the I really can't stand when Bitcoiners focus on fighting CBDCs because I think it's the most pointless form of grandstanding. It's like almost like it's so useless. Like the difference between Bitcoin and a CBDC couldn't be more stark. The difference between Bitcoin and a group of governments that decide to launch Ethereum-backed stable coins and then prop up the entirety of the crypto system under the auspices that they're innovating and therefore creating jobs and therefore supporting the tech industry and therefore supporting Wall Street is much higher. Like that Leviathan, I think, is the really scary one. And so that's what I'm most worried about. And I think that's why I think the best thing we can do is really try to understand, like, the rest of the crypto system. I think we tend to think that we can ignore the rest of the crypto system into irrelevance. And I think that might be one of our, probably biggest mistakes that we're making as a community. Like it seems pretty obvious that if I was going to attack Bitcoin, I would take advantage of the system that, you can claim publicly. Yeah, there's just like so much you can do when you are just claiming to do something in the name of innovation and in the name of like these other systems, that I think the union of those two things is really going to be bad. And I don't really understand how we wouldn't see that, right? I don't know. If you want Bitcoin to be like this world-changing idea, I think it's very clear like the world like requires that like great people and great things like overcome a lot of adversity. This is like a classic like narrative storytelling, right? Like that you have to triumph over great evil, right? So I think if Bitcoin is truly a great thing, it will need to do the same. Very unpopular theory, but I'll leave you with that.
Interesting. Well, I've loved talking to you. Thank you so, so much. I feel like this is going to be a really great episode for a lot of people that haven't dug into Satoshi and the history. Where can people find you?
Twitter at Pete_Rizzo_, publish on Bitcoin Magazine and Forbes occasionally. And yeah, always happy to chat with people about, the early days of Bitcoin and Satoshi Nakamoto, get a lot of DMs. Always happy to look at some obscure link that you're interested in and, chat about the mystery. So appreciate the time. And yeah, it was great to chat finally. So
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so, so much, Pete. Thank you so much for checking out this show. Again, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on any new content. And I love to hear your feedback. Leave a comment or send me an email at natalie@talkingbitcoin.com. Let me know what you think, if you have guest suggestions, and I'll see you next time.